good evening, this is Hound Dog Steve coming to you on a very chilly January the 28th. We have our second snowstorm in as many days coming in, and it is a brisk minus 12 degrees centigrade. Anyway, welcome back to all of you, and this evening I would like to talk about a review or a letter that's been written by the 30 top intellectuals who say that Europe is falling apart before our very eyes, and indeed it is. And the reason for this is that the idea of Europe, the unification of Europe, so I can see that after the Second World War there was a desire to unify, to get along with your neighbours and put the past behind you, and that's essentially what they did for 20 or 30 years up into the 70s. The countries of Europe got along moderately well together. There was no border skirmishes. The biggest change in Europe, of course, was the coming down of the wall between East and West Germany. And but other than that, communism was starting to collapse. There was the de-balkanization of Eastern Europe, and things were going along pretty well. Now, I will agree that the border situation was very much, it hadn't changed much since the wartime. And anyone who's travelled through Europe in the 60s, 70s and 80s will know exactly what I'm talking about. So again, I can understand the desire for streamlining of all that kind of stuff. So when they decided to drop the necessity for passports to travel from one country to another, it was actually brilliant. It meant a much free-flowing border situation. People could work in different countries. It really streamlined the process. You didn't need to go through all of the immigration and the paperwork. You could simply just start a job in another country, and so you could move where there was actually work and where there were shortages. So it all worked reasonably well. The countries were trading with each other. The movement of goods was reasonably free. But then somebody had the bright idea of going one step further and integrating the currency. And somehow in that process the countries of Europe lost their identity, and they were kind of squeezed into a huge bureaucratic monstrosity called Brussels. And so the decision making suddenly became completely bogged down, and Brussels suddenly became all about the process of Brussels, and the public got left behind in the process. And when you look around, we're seeing this everywhere now, even in Ontario in Canada, where municipalities have amalgamated. These amalgamations have been a disaster, okay, and many of these municipalities want to get out of the amalgamation because it's just dragging them down financially. These municipalities have requirements in different areas. Kawartha Lakes is huge, and there's farming, there is quarrying, there is some industry, a lot of tourism, retirement, and so when you focus the leadership into the bureaucracy of central planning, all of these different needs fall to the wayside, because you cannot understand what the requirements of an area that is quarrying from a central location. There are the residents, there are the trucks, there are all kinds of things that take into consideration. Okay, and City Kawartha Lakes and the other municipalities have become all about managing the city and not about taking care of business. And the cost to do that is staggering. Over 70% in Kawartha Lakes is taken just to pay the bureaucracy to manage the whole thing. And so, big or little, it doesn't matter. The same thing is happening in Europe. A huge quantity of money is being sucked into the gaping maw that is the European Union, and absolutely nothing is getting done, and people are getting frustrated. It has formed a dichotomy of the wealthy in the cities, and the middle class have been pushed out to the urban and rural areas, and so they have become completely disenfranchised and much more susceptible because their incomes are not as high as they were when they were working in the city, and their expenses have increased. So you put all of this mixed together, and you've got the perfect recipe for a rise in populism. Anyway, before we get too far into this, let me just go over to this manifesto, and we'll just take a quick skim through. But I want you to pay particular attention how interestingly it contradicts itself. It's written in such a way where they use all of these scary terms, like the barbarians at the gate and this kind of stuff, but yet it gives you evidence of why the horde is rising up, why the public are rising up. And it begs the question, why are you trying to fight nationalism and populism when really what you should be doing is trying to understand the underpinnings that are causing this? As I say, if you'd have just stopped at making border traffic easier, to streamline that and leave it alone, the integration would have taken place naturally and organically, and it would have worked. But no, you had to go authoritarian about the whole thing, completely try and control everybody, everything, and this is the outcome. Okay, so here we go. The Guardian, Europe coming apart before our eyes, say top 30 intellectuals. Group of historians and writers published manifesto warning against rise of populism. And here we have Poland and Hungary, and this is Jarosław Kaczynski and Viktor Orban. Liberal values in Europe face a challenge, not seen since the 1930s. Leading intellectuals from 21 countries have said, as the UK lurches towards Brexit and nationalists look set to make sweeping gains in EU parliamentary elections. The group of 30 writers, historians and Nobel laureates declared in a manifesto published in several newspapers, including The Guardian, that Europe as an idea was coming apart before our eyes. We must now will Europe or perish beneath the waves of populism, the document reads. We must rediscover political voluntarism or accept that resentment, hatred and their cortege of sad passions will surround and submerge us. They write of the regret that Europe has been abandoned from across the Channel, and an oblique reference to the drawn-out Brexit process that has arguably brought Anglo-European relations to their lowest point since the Second World War. And they say that unless efforts are made to combat a rising tide of populism, the EU elections will be the most calamitous that we have ever known. Victory for the wreckers. Disgrace for those who still believe in the legacy of Erasmus, Dante, Goethe, Comenius. Disdain for intelligence and culture. Explosions of xenophobia and anti-Semitism. Disaster! Abandoned from across the Channel and from the Atlantic by the two great allies who in the previous century saved it twice from suicide. Vulnerable to the increasingly overt manipulations of the master of the Kremlin, Europe as an idea, as will and representation, is coming apart before our eyes, the text reads. Okay, so I love this little part down here, okay? In the UK, I hope Parliament may yet have the courage to call for a second referendum that could rescue the country from the calamity of Brexit and go a long way towards rescuing the EU as well. So there's firstly an admission how important Brexit is and that the EU needs to be rescued. But down here it goes on to say that Pamuk said the idea of Europe was also important to non-Western countries. Without the idea of Europe, freedom, women's rights, democracy, egalitarianism is hard to defend in my part of the world. Well, isn't democracy sticking to the vote? You want a second referendum? That's not democracy, my friend. You had the vote, you set the conditions of the vote, and you lost. That's it. End of story. Freedom. How can you be free when you are being governed from Brussels? When you are being governed by unelected officials who are deciding how you are going to run your home, what you are going to import and export, what you are going to regulate those imports and exports under, how and where your resources are going to be allocated. This is totally authoritarian government by unelected officials. That is not freedom. That is not democracy. And it is definitely not egalitarianism. Yes, you have women's rights, but we have women's rights. Women's rights are written into the Constitution. Women's rights are protected by legislation. All people's rights in the Western world certainly, are protected by legislation already. We didn't need the EU to do that. In the EU elections in May, the first time that will not include Britain, most observers predict a rise in support for populist, nationalist or anti-immigration parties. Many of them have made significant gains in national elections, as the centre-right and the centre-left that have traditionally dominated Europe's post-war politics retreat. Matteo Salvini of Italy's far-right League has described the vote as a straight choice between the Europe of the elites, banks and finance, immigration and precarious work, and that of the people and of labour, pledging to form a Eurosceptic Italian-Polish axis. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban has said that the elections are a chance to bid farewell to liberal democracy. Unlike Eurosceptics in the UK, most European counterparts do not want to leave the EU but to take it over. Leading the charge against the resurgent right-wing populists are the French President Emmanuel Macron and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. While both have been weakened by domestic problems of public uprisings of their own people who are demanding that they pay attention to the working people and the pensioners who have given their lives and contributions to the country, let's not forget that. This week they renewed their country's vows of post-war friendship and warned the lessons of their bloody past were being forgotten. So there you go. As I said, the big issue is the divide between these two sides. And I think that rather than seeing each other as the enemy, well, you're just going to go into a new Cold War. That's going to be the outcome of this situation if we don't start getting the olive branches out and reaching across the divide and finding common points to work on. I've already been through one Cold War. I don't want to go through another. And it's up to us in the public to act and to recognize what is going on here. So speak out, my friends, speak out. And again, I want to draw attention to the fact that the word populism is a very misrepresented word, because Jeremy Corbyn, for example, who is the Labour leader of the opposition in England, is a populist Labour leader, a populist left-winger. Okay, so populism and nationalism is not the bastion of the right wing. That is the first big point to make. And what I find absolutely interesting is you see with all of these nation states around the world, in Europe pretending that there are no nation states, but when they go to the Olympics, what are they doing? They're encouraging national pride. The same with football or soccer, all of these games, ice hockey, we are expected to have national pride when there is no nation. So how can you have national pride and not be a nationalist? So all of these things are very conflicting, and of course when you disenfranchise the public, you take a huge risk, because approximately across the world, and I'm just kind of ballparking these figures, there is around 6 billion, that's a billion with a B, regular folk, and there's maybe, tops, even if there was a billion of the elites. I think you are strategically outnumbered. So what I find interesting about that manifesto is that there seems to be no self-awareness, and there is no willingness to try and understand what's going on. The whole attitude seems to be, okay, that's it, we've got our position, people are going to take away the democracy and blah, 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 and they're the enemy and that's that and all about it. Rather than trying to entrench their position and then wonder why the other side is becoming entrenched. I don't know whether you can see the path that is leading us to further and further entrenchment of ideas and less chance that we're going to reconcile those two positions. It's all there right in front of your eyes. You just have to open them, smell the coffee, smell the roses, whatever analogy you choose to use, but there you are. Until we start recognizing that these two sides have to somehow acknowledge each other, acknowledge the public. And again, you see, this is, even if the manifesto is correct, and it is a worst case scenario, and you get a complete totalitarian situation, well, I'm sure it will turn out to be the equal and opposite in the size and totality of the authoritarianism regime that's taking place. You see, both these things, I think maybe that's what we should draw from it as the public, is we don't want either of these regimes going on. You do not want authoritarianism, and you do not want totalitarianism. Either are the enemy of the public. And so, as I say, they wrongly attribute this to the 1930s, when really it is the 1780s and the French Revolution. Okay? This is truly a people's uprising taking place here. And I'm going to be very interested to see how it works out, because I can almost hear the wheels of the guillotine being rolled out into the streets. These people have pushed the envelope way too far, and they're seeing now the public push back. So remember the cautionary tale of Louis XVI and the guillotine. So if you've enjoyed the information in this video, please comment, like and subscribe below. Click that big red button, it really does help when you do. In the meantime, this is Hound Dog Steve signing off. I hope you have a very pleasant week. You take care, stay safe, and we will talk to you very, very soon. See you now. Bye.